Right. Well, thanks again to both of you for coming in. The Columbian is pleased to welcome candidates from the 49th Legislative District, Position 2. Okay, I want to make sure I had that right. I'm Greg Jane, the editorial page editor at the Columbian, and I'll let the board members introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Colleen Keller. I'm the assistant news editor of the Columbian and member of the editorial board.
I'm Craig Brown, I'm the editor of the Columbian and Columbian.com.
And Ben Campbell, publisher and co-owner of the Columbian.
Right, and now on to the candidates. Please take 1 to 2 minutes, introduce yourselves, explain why you are running for this position, and then we'll move on to specific policy questions. And we'll start with Russell.
Sure. So I'm Russell Barber. My wife and I moved here 24 years ago after the military. Met my wife in the military, and I was a Texas boy. She was a California girl, and I didn't want California. She didn't want Texas, so we ended up here. We got 4 kids, all raised here in the district. Like I said, I honorably served in the Air Force. There I learned, integrity, leadership, teamwork skills. Currently, I'm a software engineer. Lately, I've been more focused in security, cybersecurity. Software engineering has really taught me a lot of good problem-solving skills. I work, part of my everyday task is really just to solve problems. Why am I here? A couple years ago during COVID, I worked at the VA. There, it was a different experience. It kind of reminded me what it meant to serve. Rather than creating a product, what I did there was basically just make it better for the members, VA or the veterans. And it just kind of reminded me that there's more than just a product. There's to serve. And I think that's why I'm here.
Great, thank you. Monica.
Thanks. Monica Stonier, state representative currently in the 49th legislative district. Have been living here in Clark County. My husband and I chose to move here and raise our family here when we were first married and have been here since. Been an educator in Evergreen Public Schools for, I think we're looking at 25 or 26 years now, both as a classroom teacher and as an instructional coach, providing professional development for the district. Also provides me some insight for the biggest ticket item that we have in the state legislature, which is providing a strong public school system to the best of our ability. Other than that, I have 2 kids of my own. I think the first time I sat in this room, they were 4 and 6. They are now 19 and 21, and just as expensive as ever. So grateful that our family has grown and flourished here. And I think a lot of that has been a function of the community responding well to local elected and unelected leaders doing their best to provide for the community over all else. And I've had a chance to do that in Olympia and hope to continue doing that.
Great, thank you. And thanks again to both of you for being here. One of the big issues facing the legislature and all the communities in the state is homelessness and affordable housing and housing supply. How would you assess the legislature's efforts to deal with that and what more needs to be done? And start with Monica.
Sure. I think the last several times that the legislative election cycle has come around, the question has been asked, what is the legislature doing? Is it enough? What else should be done? And the last time I was here, I gave an answer that I think is similar to what I'll say today. The tools that we have at our disposal are simply not enough to keep pace with the problem as it grows. We know that adding to the supply takes time. It's not the passage of a bill or the timeline associated with that can increase supply as we need to. So that is an effort that's underway, but also slow going. And we have looked to try and find some other ways to try and stabilize the housing market for people. I know that the Columbian wrote a great deal about House Bill 2114, which was an effort to try and stabilize the cost of housing while still allowing landlords to increase their rent to the extent that it would allow them to pay the bills as they would need to as a business owner. But also recognize that stabilizing that high cost of housing is one thing that needs to happen in order to keep people in their homes. So we have a toolkit. We're continuing to grow it. I would say the challenge the legislature faces is that there's not just one solution that would work across the board. So when we hear about housing issues in Seattle being different from Yakima, being different from Vancouver, being different from Spokane, it's hard to gather the votes for a statewide approach when that approach may not work best in every corner of the state. So I think our job is just to continue adding tools to the toolbox for renters to stay in their homes, and then also for local jurisdictions to have what they need to provide housing. Proud to be from Vancouver, where we passed Prop 1 here that said, you know, as a community, we want to take a step.
So in that regard, do municipalities, do city governments, do they need more power at their disposal to make these decisions, or how should that work?
Well, I think there were a couple councilmatic kind of bills that we had kicked around in Olympia, and Olympia will continue to assess those as they come up. But that was not necessary for Vancouver to do what Vancouver did. So I think what we have on the books is something that can be effective, at least for our community right now.
Russell, your thoughts, what should the legislature do about housing?
Sure. So homelessness and affordable health care, it's critical. Last year, there was a House Bill 1404, and that basically tried to address expediting permitting process. And it would allow cities to then adopt that. And I finally see it as a supply and demand issue. There's only 25 affordable units for every 100 low income person looking. And so addressing that, I think that's the main thing that we should be focused on, as well as maybe even tax incentives to increase housing. I don't see rent control. I see that as a Band-Aid. We're basically asking landlords to basically eat the cost of inflation, as well as, there's other things in the bill too. There's some provisions to force the district attorney to mediate matters. I worry that that's going to create a backlog as well. So there's some teeth in there as well. So I worry also that's going to also reduce the supply. Landlords won't want to rent if there's consequences, and then there's a fixed ability to get increases. So I see, finally, a supply and demand issue. We need to get more supply, and I see working on 1404, getting that passed, and then working with Vancouver City Council to have Vancouver pass that, so we can expedite the permitting process, get more affordable housing built.
Would increasing supply, would that also involve adjusting the Growth Management Act to expand urban boundaries? Would you be in favor of that?
I don't know. I don't know the issues there.
Monica, were you in favor of the rent stabilization bill?
I was.
And what is that?
Well, again, anybody who owns a home knows what their mortgage is going to cost them every month they pay the mortgage bill. People who rent do not have that level of stability. Providing some stability helps people be able to plan long-term. If I'm a renter and I can't keep up with the increasing cost of my rent, I'm never going to be in a position to buy a home. So the hope is that as supply comes online, folks are not facing unreasonable and unpredictable costs to their home, to renting, so that they can continue to stay on track to move towards ownership. So I think those two in tandem make good sense. I thought it was important for us to negotiate an incredibly complex bill, high stakes, no question. It was a short session. It was way too long of a conversation to have in a short session, but we felt it was important to at least air as much of the conversation as possible so we could come back with the next proposal.
And do you think that conversation will come up again next year?
Absolutely. I think the House passed it. There are many members in the Senate who were supportive. There were a few who were not. Also, again, it was a short session. Folks had questions that didn't get answered. Hopefully we'll have those answers when we get back, and the makeup of the Senate will likely be a bit different than it was this last time around.
What about the argument that forces landlords to eat the cost of inflation?
Sure. I think we've heard that argument all along. That's exactly why it is not rent control. It is rent stabilization. It allows increases for rent. I've heard it characterized as forcing increases, which is not the case. It allows for increases that landlords may need to put on the books in order to upkeep the building or what have you. And we took the policy off of the books for new construction because Renters with new construction aren't gonna have the same types of, hopefully not have the same types of needs for increasing that rent. And those who were working on providing supply had a great deal of opposition to that. We didn't see that conflicted with the mission of the bill, and so agreed to do that in one of the versions of the bill that we passed off the floor. So, I think the conversation is alive and well. I think it's healthy. I may be in a different position than others in terms of wanting to make sure we do something that kind of controls that cost. So it's not just homeowners like myself who know what my housing bill is going to be every month and can plan from that standpoint. That's why we're able to manage having 2 kids in college right now. I think other families deserve the same stability.
And then following up on that, Russell, then what about homelessness?
Thanks, yeah.
What kind of powers should municipalities have?
Yeah, so we have the safe stay villages. I think we have 4 of them. I think the last survey that we had about 1,400 homeless people here in Clark County. If you take the 4 villages that we have, 40 residents per village is 1,600. Can we 10x those villages and create 36 more villages? I was looking at that. What concerns me about that is the cost to maintain those. Each one of those buildings costs as much as an apartment. So I was a little shocking to see that.
So should the legislature be involved in helping cities with those costs?
I don't know.
Or are you saying that perhaps is not an approach that the legislature should encourage?
Yeah.
You see some other kinds of approaches that perhaps the legislature should.
So I can see the safe stay as a short-term situation where we can get people at least in the house, get them out of tents into housing, and then look to expedite construction. That would be my approach. And through 1404 to expedite permits.
Monica, how does this tie into homelessness?
I mean, I will absolutely agree that our safe stay villages are great temporary first steps. We know from hearing the stories that you all have written about and that we've seen on the news in other states that have implemented such a strategy, that people care a great deal about being able to take a shower and get ready for a job interview or go to a training, knowing their belongings are locked someplace safe, knowing that they have a contact with social services that might help them get on their feet, and they eventually find themselves in more stable housing and then eventually a homeowner. And, I think that is exactly the vision that we want to deliver on. I don't think there's much debate around that. But I also agree that investing in short-term housing that does only the minimum is not going to be a solution to the problem. We have to also make sure we're investing in long-term sustainable funding for people who need that housing with complicated needs, that might have mental health challenges, that might have different ability levels to hold down a job, might be on some subsidized support from the community, so that everybody has an opportunity to have a place to live, and it's not completely a matter of, whether or not they have had a place to lock up their stuff for a night. So the long-term sustainable funding for housing has to stay, I think, a major focus of ours, and these other approaches in the meantime to help people get on their feet. So we can kind of figure out who is it that can take the next step on their own with some support, and who is it that's going to need a greater level of support from the community. We can't talk about all people who are not with a home in the same way. Folks have different needs, and we should diversify our approaches to support them at each of those levels.
And I think I asked Russell, I don't remember, did I ask you, would you be in favor of expanding the urban growth boundaries?
Yes,
Under the
I
growth
think
for
we
now.
have to think about doing it in a way that provides the resources necessary to also support the density that we need in some areas. And so, that's the whole give and take
As
of.
far as infrastructure.
Exactly. And, each local jurisdiction is going to have feelings and votes to take related to whether or not they are willing to invest in that type of infrastructure. And so being mindful of that as we expand, I think is really important, because those elected officials have to answer their constituencies as well.
Okay, thank you. Colin?
Yes, there are several fairly major initiatives that will be on the ballot in November. And the ones that we're sort of referring to as the big 3, about Climate Commitment Act, capital gains, and the Washington Cares long-term care program. I'm curious where each of you stand on those initiatives. And Russ, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So yes, I do support them. I think a yes vote to them would be great. I see the initiatives as the people's voice, and if I was in this position, I would probably yield to that. I think that would say, I represent the people, and this is the people's voice. So as for the different three bills, 2109, I believe it's the Commitment Act.
2109 is capital gains.
Oh, you're right. Thank you.
That's
Capital
what I
gains.
read now.
Capital gains. So, yeah. So I don't like this because so part of my business, I do get stock options for my company, and I think that's maybe it's a tech industry thing. But at some point, I'd like to cash these things in, and so I would probably be hit with this 7%. In other situations, 7% is maybe a year's worth of gains. If you were making 7% a year, that's a year's basically value wiped out. So I don't, I think they call it an exercise tax, but in my case, it's part of my benefits. I see this as another tax on me. So yeah, that's 2109. Don't care for that. 21.
Wait, you do care for the initiative, you don't care for the
Correct.
capital gains?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yes, I think repealing that would be good.
Okay.
2114, I believe that is the, I'm sorry.
I have 2117 is.
Yes,
climate
17,
commitment.
thank you. That's the Climate Commitment Act. And so this is basically, we want to get down to, reduce the 95% of the greenhouse emissions. That's pretty strict, I think. And part of this too is the cap and trade. And what we've seen from that, initially we were told it was just gonna be pennies, and it's dollars. My gas, Northwest Natural, I think it's $28 a month extra now. CPE, that they just had an increase in theirs. All directly tied to this. So it is hurting people as well as just gas as well. So it's a lot more than, and that just basically got passed along to the customer basically. And so the other side of that too is, I think they collected $1.8 billion. I would like to see how many megawatts have we put into the grid? How are we using these dollars effectively? And I just don't see that. I don't see any projects that are going to get us on a course that this, to me, would represent the future of, we're going away from emissions. What solar, what wind are we using? I just don't see it. So I'm against that. The only thing I won't go into it, but if I was elected and this initiative was put down, I would look at those dollars and start looking at how to use those dollars effectively. I think we could, it's about $1 million per megawatt. We could put some solar panels out there. I think the money could be used effectively, and just, I don't see it where it is right now at this point. And then the third initiative is the long-term care. So I get that as a benefit to my company. As a VA, I do have a claim, so I probably won't need long-term care. So in this initiative, basically it's to allow people to opt out. And in my case, I would opt out. So I would want this to pass so I could opt out.
Would you worry that if it does pass, that that system would collapse, that it wouldn't be sustainable?
I don't know about that, 'cause I know there's a, max 36,000 ability. And maybe that could be adjusted where it said, maybe it's not 100% of that. Maybe since so many people pulled out, we could do a percentage of that. I see it as, a state benefit. Not necessarily, I don't think we should be forcing on everybody. Everybody's different. At least be able to opt out.
So do you have any concerns that, say, for instance, if the capital gains tax was overturned, that money right now goes to education, early childhood education and K through 12, about losing that money?
Yeah, so I seen the education budget balloon. It's pretty much doubled in the last 10 years. I think, I'm not sure exactly the amount. I think it's a million or billion or so. So I don't quite remember exact figures. I want to say it's 2 billion, but I think that can be absorbed through the budget increases that we've already seen to education.
Okay. And Monica, your thoughts on the initiatives?
Yeah, well, I voted for each of the bills in the legislature as an elected official, and I understand that what we're experiencing now is, a response from voters to what we've been doing in Olympia. I think we should take that very seriously. Absolutely agree that the initiative process exists to give people a voice who may not feel that they're reflected in the elected officials who have passed bills in Olympia. But also would point out that the way you get something onto the ballot or an initiative to the legislature is a very small number of the electorate to sign those petitions in order to get them there. The actual debate happens where we are now, which is once they're on the ballot, people have a chance to learn about them, and both sides have an opportunity to share the full story. Many people who are concerned about a capital gains tax, I don't know that I know that I certainly don't pay the federal capital gains tax. I don't make that much money. I don't have those investments. We were sure to make sure that people in Washington state who would pay the state capital gains would not be in that category. So we're talking about, very few of the wealthiest families in the state that has the second worst rating when it comes to people with the highest income paying the least amount of their income for the services that the state provides. So from that perspective, absolutely was proud to support this policy and knew that passing a tax for the sake of passing a tax is not necessarily something my constituents would approve of. It has to be something that we know the community is asking for and needs help from the legislature. So I think we're kind of seeing a difference in opinion about the role of state government. I believe the role of state government is to try and help out when local jurisdictions can't solve a problem on their own, and the federal government is nowhere near close to helping us. The childcare crisis in Washington state is exactly that type of problem. I think that's exactly the right way for the legislature to engage. And I'm glad that we were able to associate a reversal on our regressive tax structure into something that people actually know they need in order to go to work and to keep their businesses open. So I think that's a tangible contact. I think it makes sense. The Climate Commitment Act, I'll tell you, for the last 2 years, I have sat in a forum where I'm before, the chamber, either here in Southwest Washington and our business community, or sitting in for the speaker in places like Spokane. Every single time before I'm asked about the opinions about the Climate Commitment Act and its investments, I talk with several people from each of those communities about investments they would like to make with climate commitment dollars. So we have to be very clear about what it is that we would be repealing and the investments that people would be repealing if we were to reverse the funding for the Climate Commitment Act. A really good example, my favorite example, is the grants for electric school buses that we passed this last year are directly tied to climate commitment. So without CCA dollars, districts will not have the ability to apply for grants where they can have electric buses instead of gas buses blowing fuel and smoke into the faces of children while they're waiting for their buses. These are the kinds of things that the CCA was designed to do. Make investments that people want to reverse the negative impacts of pollution in a way that makes sense to them. And I hope that more local communities will start looking at the grants and the options that are available to them to make the changes that they say they want to, but don't have the revenue to do. That was the design. I know that there's some concern about the cost of gas and electricity. All of that is fair. That happens every single time. It happened when we went from coal to gas. I mean, anytime we're transitioning through in the market to a new type of power, those fluctuations happen. And I think we made some strides this year to try and mitigate those for our lowest income and highly impacted families. We'll continue doing that. definitely get a chance to see on our power bill where there may be an increase from the Climate Commitment Act. It's right there, it's listed. It's also listed the credit I get back on my bill as a result of changes that we've made. So I just want to point out, all sides of that argument and not just the single cost to one household, and try not to forget about the improvements it makes to the community broadly. Again, I think that's the role of state government. The Long-Term Care Trust Act certainly has had a great deal of scrutiny, and I think rightfully so. We did some adjustments to allow for some portability so that people paying into it could, or people coming into the state could adjust if they were not paying into the program immediately, and people leaving the state could be adjusted for as well. I think that was a fair and important adjustment to make. But as was just raised in the question here, giving everybody the chance to opt out means that the program is not soluble. It collapses. And we also know that doing something for the first time in the nation, like trying to provide some long-term care, which is nothing that any other state has tried to do, was important for two reasons. It was a response to the fact that there is absolutely no way the federal government is ever going to put anything in place to help our communities anytime soon. The federal program is broken, and that the commitment for the $36,000 was not intended to provide a facility for people, which I think easily undermines the messaging there. It was intended to provide the services and the support that people would need to age respectfully in their chosen community. So that means putting a ramp in for somebody in a rural community, providing extra hours of home health care for an aging community member, so that they are not looking at a higher bill to live somewhere else in a different facility. They can live for several more months and even years in their home, where they are healthier, more comfortable, and we provide the support that they need in order to stay there longer. It actually saves money over time for the state. So yes, rocky start, no question. I will not back away from that. But I, again, think it's the right thing to do. We are paying for people without long-term care anyways out of our state coffers when they call 911 repeatedly for something that they don't need help for. That could be easily intervened. We are paying for them on the back end in a number of ways, in the high healthcare cost healthcare system, in transportation and emergency services, in housing challenges. To act like this is a new cost is doesn't tell the whole story.
Thank you.
And credit to you, I have to say, for trying to remember the numbers. I have not been able to do.
I tried.
I wasn't even gonna try, so I give you credit.
Thanks for writing them down.
Yeah, I made notes for myself.
Kind of like a math problem.
Yeah.
Speaking of math, I wanted to ask about the state budget. For many years, state tax revenue grew in excess of the forecast. The latest that I heard was that it was growing slower than forecast, which could make next year a tough budget year in Olympia. So what should the legislature, assuming that comes to pass, what should the legislature's response do? Do we tap the rainy day fund and look for some temporary cuts, or should we be looking at more major and permanent types of program reductions? So Monica, do you want to start with that?
Sure, yeah. I think the forecast I saw does have us growing at a slower rate, no question. That is, mitigating expectations for members is going to be, job number one when we get to Olympia. But also from our communities who think that at the start of every new budget year is a time for big investments. We may have been able to do that in the past. We're not going to be able to do that in the future. The investments that we are going to get, or the revenue that we are going to get, are mostly spoken for. We've already committed to paying our state employees. We have a 4-year forecast in paying for public schools. A lot of what we already have coming in the budget in our forecast is committed to commitments we've made in the past. We do a 4-year outlook when we're budgeting for a reason, and that's because we know that fluctuations can come and we have to plan for them. So I think that's the first thing we just have to understand. I will say, if we're looking at adjustments and investments where we should be investing dollars, my number one priority is going to be doing what I believe is our moral obligation, which is to make sure that our students on IEPs and our special ed teachers have what they need in order to have a secure, safe, and thriving learning environment in our public school system. When we passed McCleary, which was before COVID, so that like setting is different now, the dressing is completely different on the stage. We had a constitutional obligation we were trying to meet with our public schools. I believe that not including special ed meant that we now are facing a moral obligation to cover funding for students that should have been included at that phase. I was not in the legislature at the time when that decision was made. I would have thrown a big fit about it if I had been, but now I have an opportunity to try and highlight that as one of the areas where I think we should consider increasing investments. That being said, we have passed a lot of new policies that have long-term impacts on the bills, on the budget over time. And in the meantime, when things are in flux, we have tried to do short-term, one-time funding approaches. And I think you'll likely see more of that if we're looking to try and get some projects done around the state for communities. But trying to, again, add to the long list of long-term funding is not going to be sustainable for us in this state when we have the tax system we have currently.
And how would you feel the rainy day fund, is that?
Oh, yes, thank you.
A good loan or?
Yeah, I mean, so the rainy day fund is super helpful in some scenarios where it's not helpful. Tapping into that fund is not helpful when it has a negative impact on our rating. The fact that we have the highest in the nation rating on our bonds is because we have funds in reserves. I see this in a number of other settings. I know when, school districts are negotiating their contracts and people are concerned about holding reserves and not putting that in the classroom. As much as I would like to see that happen, I know that you have to have reserves in order to keep the investments that you have off on the books sound, and the state has done an excellent job of doing that. We often don't agree on that amount as Democrats, and we'll get into a little exchange with the treasurer's office or the governor's office when we're trying to land on that right number. But as long as we have the reserves to keep the best bond rating possible so that the investments we make at the state level are low and functioning for people, I think it's important to keep that in check. Rainy day funds come for things that we know are not just regular market fluctuations, but truly challenges that are not a part of that regular process and need our direct assistance right away. We've even gotten better about this when it comes to forest management and fire management, for example. We're more used to kind of responding after a fire season with funds because we know that's coming. We've been preparing for that. We think about it when we're budgeting, and know that one of the first things we have to do when we come back to Olympia is cover the bills for the forest management that should have that happened in the previous summer. So we're getting better about it, but I think that rainy day fund serves a purpose, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
So, real quick, you brought up, how long have you been in the legislature?
That's a great question. It feels like a while. So this will be my fourth time running in the 49th legislative district, and I served one term but ran 3 times in the 17th legislative district.
Okay, I was just curious. Russell, your thoughts on the budget and the rainy day fund and involving the revenue forecast?
Sure. So being new to the legislature, I would be very conservative. With the outlook of the economy, I'm very, again, conservative about that. So I wouldn't be looking to do anything. I would just maintain, and I've seen our budget increase, basically by twice in the last 10 years. As for the rainy day fund, I don't have much information about that. I would be new to this. I would probably be just very conservative at this point.
When you mentioned the budget has essentially doubled in 10 or 12 years. So, isn't that a sign that the policies are working to grow state revenue?
Yeah, but we've also been spending that money as well. So yes, we've been growing. But at the same time, we've been spending and growing government at that rate too. So I would be really concerned any kind of disruption could sort of upset that as well.
Okay, thank you. Craig, did you have a follow?
No, I don't.
Okay, Ben?
Yes, this question is from Monica. If you had to pick one thing that you would have done different in your current term, what would
My gosh, I wish you'd given me a little more time to think about it. You know, I do have an answer to that, and it is a response from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. As you know, I'm elected by my caucus to serve as the floor leader. And that comes with a fun set of challenges. People don't want to work long into the night, but they don't want their bill to be the one that comes off the list. People think that we should manage debate a little bit better between the two sides of the aisle, but nobody really wants to help out with doing that. So we get to the point towards the end of session where it's a little unpredictable how long our nights are going to go. And we're also faced with passing bills that have come from the other chamber. And so I would say I remain committed if I were elected again. And if I could go back with the time machine that you've gifted me, I would go back and reprioritize some of the bills that we spent a lot of time on, recognizing that there may not have been the votes for them in the Senate, and making the case to my chamber that if it's not going to pass this year, we don't have to stay long into the night for it this time. We can come back and work on it again in the future. We have folks that people need sleep, need nutrition. Restaurants close in Olympia fairly early, so if you don't get out of there in time, you're not going to find a good meal. And I think it's important to keep health in check with the hard work of running the House floor. So I would probably narrow my redo specifically to that job as floor leader.
And then Russell, how do you think your experience in cybersecurity would help you deal with?
Sure. So, interesting. So where I'm at, we have vulnerabilities. We discover vulnerabilities every day. And, when we find something, we don't wait for it to be exploited. We go, we patch it. And I kind of feel like that is kind of the sort of the methodology that I bring is, when there's problems, and maybe I'll talk about election integrity. There are some vulnerabilities there, and maybe we should target those and increase the security there. I think that's a pretty good explanation there, I think.
And along those lines, do you feel our elections in this state and this county, are they secure?
So do we require citizenship to vote? Do we check that citizenship?
Yes.
We do, okay. That's new to me. I thought I had my research and I didn't see where we do any kind of verification on citizenship. Good to know. We do mail vote. I believe it's by signature. Anybody could fill it out, sign it. There's no like two-factor with that. I would look at increasing that security. I want to know that is the person that voted. And maybe there's some code or something. I'm not quite sure. I'm just throwing out ideas here.
Do you think there is a lot of fraud with elections?
I hope not, but you don't know, just like any vulnerability. If you're aware of it, you should probably fix it, or you should at least do something about it. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but you don't know what you don't know.
Colin?
Yeah, let's talk about transportation a little bit. Russell and I were chatting just before you got here, Monica, about today there was I-5 was in classic form. I'm curious for specifically your position on replacement of the I-5 bridge and the Washington State, the legislature's role in that. And secondly, an issue that cropped up quite a bit over the past couple of years with the whole question of, is the legislature putting too much transportation money into new projects and not enough into maintenance, which I think is a good question. So Russell, let's start with you on transportation.
So transportation, yeah, So I-5 Bridge, I think that's about 20 years now that's been ongoing. I think it was like the CRC before, now it's something else. In my research, we've spent $700 million so far planning this bridge, and we really haven't broken ground on anything. As for the current state of the project, I look and I've seen different designs. At some point, I feel like we're just getting fleeced at this point. I would like to see some time limits. Okay, we're either gonna do it or we're not. I feel like it's being prolonged and I'm not quite sure if we're just getting fleeced this whole time. And then the cost, I mean, I think $8-9 billion. I mean, that's outrageous, I think, the cost on that. So, and then the tolling, and I think, Vancouver City Council, they're against it. I think everybody here in this region is against it. And then there's the cost. I don't think if we separate Washington State and Oregon, who pays how much and who's actually going to see the construction. Like, I don't believe it should be a 50-50 thing. I think there's a lot more construction on the Oregon side than the Washington side. And I think we've already put up a $1 billion and Oregon has supposedly put up their 1 billion. I don't know where we're at. And at some point, I feel like we should at least either walk away or put up some time limits. So there's that. I mean, I crossed that bridge. I worked in Portland for years, so I know that traffic, and I have not seen a good solution to this at this point. I proposed some ferrying services. I think it would be at least even while the bridge is going on. I think we could look at, Washington State operates a few ferries. And I think we can find some ferries that are passenger only, non-vehicles, that there's a couple locations that could go straight down to Portland. And I think Portland would welcome that. They want people back into Portland. And so it's less than 20 miles. So I think within an hour, we can have people get on a ferry and go downtown Portland. I would have used that service. So I think that might be a proposal that I would like to see go forward. There was a few other questions.
About the question about new projects versus maintenance.
Yeah, so you have to maintain, there's a wealth of data out there, and we can look at that data to allow the data to sort of drive where we invest these dollars. If people aren't going to a certain location or traffic isn't going, well, why spend money on that? And there's also the other side of that. They're not going because it's not built. You have to maintain before you can build. And I feel like I would want to be a lot more conservative. I wouldn't be looking at more growth at this point.
Okay, Monica.
Yeah, so the legislature certainly has a role in making sure that, new projects where it makes sense are an investment that we make. If I don't know that I would count the Columbia River Crossing a new project, I would count that as maintenance, although the price tag doesn't look like that. And a new project might be, another crossing at some point in time. But I do understand the concern that we have about the ballooning cost of the bridge and the crossing. But I think that is less a function of fleecing and an effort to kind of hide the progress from the public, and more a function of the dysfunction of our legislature here in Southwest Washington in the past. Had there not been a political fight about the bridge the first time around, we wouldn't be looking at a cost that's exponentially more than it would have been had we passed it in the past. And I have colleagues from Southwest Washington on both sides of the aisle who recognize that the biggest challenge we have right now related to the cost is the fact that we're paying for it today under inflation dollars of today's market, rather than when we would have if we passed it in the first time around. So that's another challenge is the politics around this are contributing to delay far more than anything else, in my opinion. The budget, the transportation budget dollars that would go to maintenance, I think we have to continue to stay innovative around how we are maintaining and sustaining our transportation system. I heard recently about a new way of building the infrastructure under roads, especially in rural areas where there's a lot of drainage, a lot of rock, and a lot of wear on those roads. Where if you were to just take a structure similar to tires, bind those together, fill that with gravel, that does not break away the way loose gravel would, and those roads would maintain for 4 times longer than they are today. So things like when we are repairing roads, are we looking at new approaches that could take that same dollar investment of that maintenance project and have it last exponentially longer? So, you know, I'm hopeful that we'll continue looking for and investing in those types of strategies. The problem is always going to be balance. We have to balance maintenance of our current system with where the projections of the economy, commerce, and our population growth are telling us we're going to need new projects. Just as many people will complain about the cost of that as want to have them working for them. So we're the same people, right? The same people that want to travel on those roads and get someplace in a reasonable amount of time are often the same people who are complaining about the cost of that. So keeping those in balance, I think, is really important to consider. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else? Yeah. Well, then give us your final pitch for why voters should support you, and feel free to mention any endorsements you want to share. We'll start with Russell.
Sure. So in Columbia, you know, I will focus on practical solutions to our district. I promise to be accessible, transparent about what I do. And as for endorsements, right now I'm in the process of getting endorsed by the Clark County Republican Party. They have a bit of a process, and I'm going through that right now.
Great, thank you, Monica.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll just point to some of the work that I've done already as a legislator and just share my willingness and desire to do more of that. This year, I passed a bill that ended child marriage in this state. That was a bill that has been around for a while. I'm not sure the challenges around it, but it ended up passing almost unanimously this year. Definitely work on policies related to making sure kids can graduate in a way that makes sense for them, whether they're headed to a four-year university or into the workforce right out of the gate, or perhaps a student who goes into the workforce to find their niche and then would go into a higher ed setting to better their chances for employment down the road once they discover kind of who they are and what their talents are. I have been elected, as I mentioned before, to lead my caucus on a number of issues and functions of the legislature. And I think that happens because I am known for working collaboratively across the aisle. We have a great delegation here in Southwest Washington. You know, I absolutely believe my opponent here would contribute to that from what the short time I've known him in the future, if elected. We were asked as a panel, you know, what advice do you have for future elected officials in the legislature from Southwest Washington? And unanimously across both sides of the aisle, our answer has been the same, which is we work together on behalf of our community above all else. And I feel like I've been able to do that while also being a staunch supporter of abortion and healthcare access, making sure that our communities who are policed are done so with safety and justice in mind. And, you know, I think that has borne out a couple of huge accomplishments, like working in a bipartisan fashion to expand our police workforce in the community. So I'm proud of the work they've been able to do. I'm hoping to do a little bit more before I decide whatever my next adventure may be, if anything, in elected business, but just asking for the voters to send me back to continue some of that work.
Great, thank you. Thanks both of you.